I started talking about the 25th Amendment 2 weeks into the Trump presidency when it had become painfully clear that by any previous behavioral standard applied to the presidency, Donald Trump was unfit to serve. The 25th Amendment allows for the removal of a president who is, quote, unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. The 25th Amendment leaves it to the vice president to decide when the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. It can be for health reasons, it can be for mental health reasons, it could be for reasons of corruption, or any reason the vice president chooses. The vice president cannot do this alone. He needs the written agreement of a majority of the cabinet, and with that, the vice president becomes the acting president, as long as the president remains unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. In the weeks and months that have passed since then, no one's confidence in President Trump's ability to discharge the powers and duties of his office has increased. A month into the Trump presidency, Senator Al Franken wondered aloud about the president's sanity, something that no senator had ever done with a new president. Psychiatrists and psychologists started going public with their concerns about the president's mental stability. Some of them appeared as guests on this program. And people who knew the president well and had been very friendly with him for years began to publicly question his mental health.
If he had a condition or an issue during the campaign, people close to him say it is now getting very troubling and very worrisome. There's a president isolated and out of control and in decline.
I think he's such a narcissist. It is possible that he's mentally ill in a way. He's not well.
No.
At the very least, he's not well.
Last week, when the president attacked Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski, many more people began to question the president's mental health because of the viciousness of the attack. But there was nothing new stylistically in the Trump attack. He had been at least that vicious with Rosie O'Donnell years ago and was equally vicious with Megyn Kelly during the campaign. But the negative reaction was more intense this time because of all of the accumulated bursts of Trumpian madness that preceded the attack on Joe and Mika. And then came this on Sunday, a wordless tweet that presumably captured the president's frame of mind, his state of mind about CNN.
Oh my God, what's going to happen?
The tweet seen round the world. That created a new burst of interest in the 25th Amendment and the mental stability of the President of the United States. It was like a straw breaking a camel's back. The world's strangest tweeter, given his position in our government and his position in the world, tweeted one of his strangest tweets after a week in which his mental health was already being questioned. What everyone knew the second they saw that tweet about him fighting with CNN was that the president that presidents do not do this. That's everyone's first reaction. Presidents do not do this. In a recent piece in the Los Angeles Times, psychiatrist Prudence Gourgassian considered President Trump's fitness to serve using what she calls the one source where the capacities necessary for strategic leadership are clearly and comprehensively laid out, the U.S. Army's Field Manual on Leadership. Joining us now, Dr. Prudence Gourgassian, psychiatrist and psychoanalyst and past president of the American Psychoanalytic Association. Doctor, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Run us through why the Army Field Manual and what it tells us about the president.
Well, thanks for having me tonight. I was fascinated by the language of the 25th Amendment and the idea of how would we determine that a president was unable to carry out the duties of his office. And I had the idea a couple months ago that continuing to diagnose him was not going to go very far because, first of all, you can never get 3 psychiatrists to agree on a diagnosis. And as Fox News just pointed out the other day, 49% of presidents have served with a mental health diagnosis. So I wanted to develop, I kind of had I imagined Mike Pence in the cabinet. Well, how would we decide that this president can't carry out his duties? So I started building a checklist. And ended up discovering the Army Field Manual, which is a fantastic document based on really sound psychiatric and psychological knowledge going back a century. And it comes up with a set of criteria, a set of capacities and abilities that a leader with strategic responsibility has to have. And so I put them into a pocket-sized checklist of 5 core capacities that straight out of the Army Field Manual. And anybody, you don't have to be a psychiatrist or a doctor, any observant person can take a look at these and say, does Donald Trump meet these, does he have these capabilities?
And you lay it out in this op-ed piece. Those capabilities are trust, discipline and self-control, judgment and critical thinking, self-awareness, empathy, and on the discipline and self-control, it's really quite striking because one of the things the Army Field Manual identifies is, for example, viscerally or angrily when receiving bad news or conflicting information, reacting viscerally or angrily when receiving bad news. And we recognize Donald Trump in that and pretty much everything else that the Army Field Manual does not want in leadership.
Exactly. The phrases come out at you and just, they're kind of stunning when compared to the tweets that you talked about in the introduction. Also, the capacity to anticipate consequences of your actions. And the Army Field Manual talks about not only does a leader have to anticipate immediate consequences, but secondary and third-degree consequences. And that one struck me, in addition to the lack of discipline. And they also tie together. If you don't have discipline, you can't think, you can't strategize, you can't plan. And they just, I looked at the tweet with about Mika Brzezinski, and it seemed to me that every one of the criteria fell short with that one tweet.
Yeah, every one of the criteria that would get you knocked out of a leadership position in the Army was met by the president in a single tweet, and here he is. In a single tweet, all 5. And here he is, Commander-in-Chief of that Army. The Army Field Manual has been developed, as you say, over the course of about a century. And as a psychiatrist, how would you evaluate its usefulness? Because you make the point that there's been a lot of studies about various forms, various kinds of human characteristics, but leadership is not one of them. Entrepreneurial stuff, business leadership has been written about, but this kind of leadership has not been written about.
Well, even in business, in the business literature, the basic capacities of what does it take to be a human being with vast responsibility for life and fortune of others. Even that in the business literature is not clearly pulled together in one place. The Army Field Manual was the only place I could find where anybody did that. I do want to correct one thing. I didn't mean the Field Manual had been in existence for 100 years. It does have a long history. But the background, the psychological and psychoanalytic knowledge that it's based on goes back 100 years. But the question is, how do we define, not mental health, mental illness, but capacity to shoulder enormous responsibility and the fate of nations? And this document is the only place I found that really puts that down. And I think that we're better off looking at positive attributes of capacity rather than, oh, does he have this diagnosis or that diagnosis? Because not only will there be disagreement, but it's not a diagnosis of, a mental diagnosis does not necessarily disqualify you to be president, as Abraham Lincoln famously was severely depressed at different times in his life.
Dr. Prudence Gogershon, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.